Hello and welcome to pmclounge.com. My name is Shoaib. I am the voice behind all the videos that you see on this website as well as our official YouTube channel youtube.com/pmclounge. Today I'm trying to answer a question which is what is the difference between release planning and sprint planning? This question came in on our video on Agile release planning. I'll share a link to that video in the description below. We've also talked about sprint in the past, so I'll share a link to the video on sprint as well if you want to refer to that. So those two links will be in the description. You can check that out. Now, to understand the difference between sprint planning and release planning, it is important to understand the difference between a sprint and a release. Now, a sprint, we've already talked about it. The link is in the description. You can check it out. But for quick reference, a sprint is basically a time box activity wherein, let's say, your time box is 2 weeks. So after every 2 weeks, you're generating a shippable product. That's the end goal of a sprint, right? So every 2 weeks, you have a shippable product with you, but you're not actually shipping it. You may or may not. So you have a shippable product with you, but you don't know if you're going to ship it or not. When it comes to release, let's say you do a release every 2 weeks. So all of your releases contain one sprint. So at the end of the sprint, you have a shippable product. At the end of 2 weeks, you have a shippable product. And release is when you're releasing that product to the market. That's when your product goes out into production, right? So a release is not necessarily defined by the time box of the sprint. So a sprint, let's say you have 2 week long sprint, but a release, you might do a release once every 3 months. So your each release is going to contain 6 sprints. So you have 6 sprints. That means 6 times shippable product was generated, but you actually released it. You actually shipped it only once because there's a cadence of doing a release every quarter or every 3 months. So that's the difference between the two. At the end of the sprint, you have a shippable product. You're not necessarily going to ship it, but the end of the release, you actually ship a product, which may contain one sprint or may contain several sprints. A release may not always be dependent on sprints. So let's say you manage a news website and you update it every hour or let's say every 30 minutes, right? News industry, it's fast moving industry. So let's say you need to update your website every 30 minutes. So you're actually doing a release every 30 minutes. That's what you're doing. Your website which is in production gets updated. An offline version which you have just created goes online, goes into production every 30 minutes. Is there a 30-minute sprint here? Not necessarily, right? So release may not always be dependent on sprints. Sprints may not always be dependent on release because at the end of the sprint, you're not necessarily shipping a product. You just have a shippable product. So now when you're planning these two, that's a different ball game altogether, right? When you're planning a sprint, you need to involve your product manager. You need to involve your engineering team, and you need to come up with requirements that you can deliver in the certain time box that you have for a sprint. When you're planning a release, again, it depends on the kind of release. If you're again working for that news website, you need to plan for releases every 30 minutes. So that's where your engineering and all other stakeholders are involved, and you plan on doing a release every 30 minutes based on the news that you want to update on your news websites, right? If you're doing a product release, let's say your product causes some disruption at the customer end, right? Let's say you deliver an on-premise product where the customer needs to reboot his or her environment every time they get the new version of your product, right? Every time you do a release and they get that new version through your release, they need to reboot their environment. How often do you think you're going to do the release, right? You might do a release once in 6 months, once in a year, right? So that is also possible. So that's the difference, and that's how you actually plan for your sprints and releases. These two can go together, these two can be individual as well. Now, I also wanted to introduce a topic called release on demand here. For those that have completed their SAFE certification might recall this release on demand. And that is, you do a release only when there is a need, only when there is a demand. So let's say what you're doing in the back end is you're continuing your sprints. Let's say you have 2 week long sprints. So you're continuing your sprints. Every month you're completing 2 sprints. Next month you completed 2 more sprints. Next month you completed 2 more sprints. And in the fourth month, on the fifth day, is when there's a demand for a release. That's where you feel that you need to do a release. So whatever that has been completed in the last 3 months in all those 6 sprints, you release it, you package all of it, and you release it as one release, right? So that's a concept of a release on demand, which I just wanted to touch base on. It doesn't really mess with the topic that we are dealing with, which is sprint planning and release planning. I hope you understand the difference between sprints and releases. I hope you understand how these two are actually planned, what is the relationship between the two, and they might not even be related as well. So that's all from me in this quick video. I hope you got value out of it. Smash that like button if you did. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And don't forget to check out the website pmclounge.com, your #1 free PMP resource and resource on project management. Thank you.